Okay, good day everyone. We are back here, obligations and contracts. We're now in part 3. This is your instructor, moderator, coach, attorney Lyndon Maceren. What to expect from this class? We have already discussed part 1 and part 2. Now we are in the modes of extinguishment, which is part 3, obligations. This is found in the Civil Code of the Philippines, specifically under Articles 1232 to 1304. The question, what are the modes of extinguishing obligations? Number 1, by payment or by performance, by the loss of the thing due, by the condonation or remission of debt, by confusion or merger of rights, by compensation, and by innovation. There are other modes, as these are rendered by the Supreme Court, namely annulment. This is annulment of the contract or agreement, where the parties annul the obligations, as well as rescission. This has already been undertaken. Rescission means the cancellation of the agreement or contract. Then fulfillment of a resolutory condition means that the condition of the obligation has already arrived, and arrival of the condition extinguishes the obligation. So extinguishment is, as I've said, is the same as termination or stoppage of the obligation. And we have also death of a debtor in case of personal obligations. So personal obligations are those which are to do, okay, to do, such as performing a live concert or painting or building a house. So that's performance, that's service. So if a person or a debtor dies, absolutely he can no longer perform his obligation because he's already dead. But not real obligation. Real obligation, again, is an obligation which is to give, okay? And we have mutual desistance. So meaning both the debtor and the creditor agrees to desist or not to pursue the contract or agreement. So they both desisted, and that resulted to the extinguishment of the obligation. And we will discuss numbers 1 to 6. Okay, we'll start with payment. What is payment? Of course, it is the delivery of the money. But while performance is also delivery of the thing due or the services which is being promised. So the rendition or the delivery of the thing must not be partial or not another thing. So if the debtor promised to deliver a Toyota Fortuner car, it should not be a Mitsubishi or a Isuzu. It should be the thing promised, and it should not be partial. So if the debtor obliged himself to deliver 1,000 sacks of rice, it should be 1,000 sacks of rice, not 500 sacks of rice. However, there's a note here that substantial delivery may be valid or is valid when it is not the fault of the debtor or attributed to the debtor. A case of this example is when there was the debtor promised to deliver sacks of rice, let's say 10,000 sacks of rice. But at that time, there was, after he made the promise, there was an acute shortage of rice. And the sacks of rice were immediately bought by the government. So he has no longer control because the government was trying to control the price of the palay or sacks of rice at that time. So he was no longer, the debtor was no longer, can no longer resource 10,000 sacks of rice. He was, however, he was able to garner around 9,000 sacks of rice. So in this case, there was a substantial delivery. Instead of 10,000, he delivered 9,000 sacks of rice. And in that case, it was valid, no? Because it was not his fault and there was shortage of palay after he made that promise or obliged himself after he made the contract. So how should payment be made or how performance should be made by the debtor? So to be valid, the payment or performance must comply the following requisites. Number one, it must be the debtor making the payment or performing or rendering the service to the creditor. So the debtor could be himself or his heirs if he's already dead, or his assigns, or an authorized agent, or anyone interested in the fulfillment of the obligation, or anyone as long as the creditor consents. So who is a person interested in the fulfillment of the obligation? So one who has a relationship with the debtor or in kind of a relation with the debtor, and he is interested in fulfilling the obligation. Okay. So, as I've said, the debtor should pay his heirs or assigns. A third person with his consent can also pay, or a person who has interest in fulfilling the obligation. Also, a third person, even without the consent of the debtor or without interest, can also pay. But what are the effects of these payments? So, naturally, payment made by number one, the debtor, his heirs or assigns, extinguishes the obligation. How about number two? Does it extinguish? Yes, it's also extinguished, but it entitles the third person who is paying the debt to the creditor to subrogate the person of the creditor, meaning he will take place as the creditor to the debtor. He is now the obligee. So he is now the creditor or the new creditor to the debtor. Siya na nahimo nga creditor. No? So this includes principal, so the principal obligation, let's say 10,000 pesos. The accessory, it's like the interest or the mortgage or the guarantee and even the penalty. You can also collect the accessory contracts. So mortgage is an accessory contract, guarantee, and penalty. So how about the number 3 person? When this third person without consent or interest, or without consent by the debtor or without interest, no? What is the effect of his payment? The payment is valid and the third person is only entitled to be reimbursed by the debtor to the extent that the debtor was benefited. No? But if the third person does not intend to be reimbursed by the debtor, it also extinguishes the obligation. But such payment made by the third person is a donation to the debtor. So it is deemed as a donation. Who is making the donation here? The third person. And who is the donee or the recipient? Is the debtor. Okay. So to whom payment should be made? To the creditor, to his successor, or successor in interest, or authorized agent. So if payment is made to a third person, shall it be valid? Yes, it would be valid if it concurs the following. It must the payment must have redounded to the creditor's benefit. The benefit must be to the extent of the obligation. The benefit is total, so performance is likewise total.